Ned Stark's horse trudged along the dusty road. Its rider slouched in weariness and sorrow. The wind swept northward against him, a chill foretelling the winter that would one day come. In his arms, nestled close to his chest, was a small bundle that stirred with life. The child within had fussed at intervals during the long journey from the Tower of Joy, and Ned's heart felt heavy as iron whenever he allowed himself to glance at the boy's dark tufts of hair. He wished that burden had never fallen on him, that Lyanna Stark had survived, that Rhaegar Targaryen had not lit a spark in her heart that would ignite a war. But there was no changing that now. He remembered the dying whisper of his sister on a bed drenched in blood and sweat. She had pressed the baby into his arms, and the command was as sharp as any he had ever received. "Promise me, Ned." The words echoed in his mind on repeat, and though he would keep his vow, he knew the single promise might tear the realm apart. Her child, the last remaining scion of Rhaegar Targaryen's lineage, was destined to be seen as a threat. If Robert Baratheon or any loyalist discovered that the infant was Rhaegar's son, the boy's life would be forfeit. Still, Ned had not anticipated the weight of that truth. It felt like carrying a sword pressed perpetually against his own heart, each day certain that the slightest slip would cause a mortal wound. The day passed into evening, and at last he approached the gates of an enormous encampment. Royal banners flapped from long poles, the crowned stag of House Baratheon proclaiming the victory of the rebel forces. Over these months of rebellion, Ned had grown accustomed to the chaos and bustle of armies, but his spirits sank at the sight of so many men armed with swords, spears, and warhammers. Any one of them might do the unthinkable if they learned what he carried. Ned hoped that Robert would accept the story he planned to tell. The child was to be his own bastard, fathered on some woman during the campaign. A shameful thing, perhaps, but not an impossible tale. Men often indulged in carnal pleasures while on the march, or so the soldiers liked to jest. He reasoned it would be better to sully his own honor than to doom this babe to death. He could only pray that Robert would not see the lie for what it was. Yet, as though the seven were mocking him, Ned saw that Robert was already waiting for him. The future king of the Seven Kingdoms stood near a brazier whose coals glowed in the dusk. Tall, barrel-chested, and crowned with coal-black hair, Robert had the look of a man who had known great strife and triumphed. There were lines etched into his face where once only laughter had dwelled, and a sense of command exuded from him. With him stood several lords, among them a grim-faced Jon Arryn, and the ever-watchful Stannis Baratheon, who studied Ned's arrival without a word. As Ned dismounted, the baby whimpered softly. The sound, though faint, caught Robert's ear, and he turned sharply. The expression on the victor's face was difficult to read in the wavering glow of torchlight, but Ned could see the sudden intensity in Robert's eyes. "You've returned at last," Robert said, stepping forward. "Where in the seven hells have you been?" Ned tried to steady his voice. "I was fulfilling a promise," he answered quietly, with that same measured tone that had often calmed Robert's tempers in the past. "It was important." His lie hovered on his tongue. "Ready." But Robert's gaze dipped to the child in Ned's arms. His expression darkened, suspicion forming like a storm cloud over the calm sea. "Whose child is that?" Robert demanded, his voice quiet but sharp. He did not need to shout to convey the intensity of his question. Men around them seemed keen to move closer, so Ned cast them a stern look, and they drew back a few paces. Ned drew himself up. "It is," he almost said, "his son." The vow he made to Lyanna pounded in his head. Protect the boy, hide him, never let Robert discover who he truly was. "It is my son," he said after only a moment's hesitation, forcing the words out. "Born of a woman I met during the war." For an instant, Robert said nothing. Ned felt a pang in his gut, certain that, with enough time, Robert might suspect. After all, Robert had once known Ned as a man of unwavering honor, who had never fathered a bastard or strayed from duty. But these were chaotic times. Perhaps that would be enough to quell the king's curiosity. Then Robert took a step closer, scanning the sleeping child. He placed a large hand on the crown of the baby's head, surprisingly gentle. "It's a pity, Ned," he murmured. Such heartbreak. For a good man to have to carry shame like this. But there's been enough bloodshed. The war is over, and I'll not pry further. Keep the babe if you must." He let a breath out, sounding almost relieved. "If that is your only burden, then the gods have been kinder to you than to most of us." A part of Ned tensed, grateful that Robert would let the matter rest, but the guilt sank deeper into him. He could say nothing else. He nodded solemnly and lowered his gaze, wordlessly begging forgiveness for the deception. Jon Arryn stepped forward. "We should set camp. We move tomorrow to King's Landing." He cast a swift look at the babe in Ned's arms, and Ned wondered how much Jon Arryn guessed. Later that evening, Ned settled in a small tent he had been given near Robert's grand pavilion. He held the child, pressing a gentle kiss to the boy's forehead, feeling the warmth of the baby's skin. "I promised her, and I will protect you," Ned whispered, his voice thick. "Jon, that's what I shall call you." His mind drifted to the memory of Jon Arryn, the man who had mentored him and Robert both, who had risked everything to shelter them. If anyone would deserve to have this boy named in his honor, it was Jon Arryn. Night rolled on, quiet except for the distant sounds of soldiers reveling in their victory. Ned lay upon the hard ground, cloak wrapped about himself and the baby. He felt the raw ache of sorrow for Lyanna and all that had been lost. Duty, family, honor, a triad that made up so much of a Stark's being. He had not realized how heavily a lie would weigh upon those words. But he shut his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the past days drag him into a restless sleep. When dawn broke, the host marched toward King's Landing. Wary eyes were set on Ned and the babe, but no one dared speak openly. In truth, everyone was too busy coping with the aftermath of war. The Targaryens had lost, and the rebels had won. All that remained was for Robert to claim the throne. Yet the city was left battered by Tywin Lannister's timely yet brutal assistance. The rumors spoke of atrocities done within the Red Keep, the slaughter of Rhaegar's wife and children. Ned's stomach twisted at the very notion of it. That knowledge alone told him what Robert might do if he knew the truth of Jon's blood. The child in Ned's arms was the last living testament to Rhaegar Targaryen. If that came to light, the boy would be murdered on the spot. They arrived to the city's outskirts. Smoke still rose from certain quarters, and the stench of burned flesh and rotting bodies was potent. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the walls in a grim orange glow, like the dying embers of a once great fire. Robert led the host triumphantly through the gates, his black warhorse stomping over fallen stones and debris. Crowds gathered to gawk or to cheer half-heartedly, uncertain of their new king. In time, the rebels took control of the Red Keep. Lannister men had secured it in the name of the new king, though each step Robert took was rife with tension. Would he reward the Lannisters or cast them aside for their late arrival to his cause? For now, he accepted Tywin Lannister's fealty, if only to maintain order. Ned followed behind with Jon in his arms, heart pounding with every corridor they passed. He took lodging in the old Tower of the Hand, given to him as recognition of his new station. Robert had chosen him to be Hand of the King. That forced Ned to remain at court rather than return to Winterfell as swiftly as he would have liked. But refusing the new king's request would have been unwise. Perhaps it was meant as an honor, but Ned felt it more as an obligation. In those first weeks after the war's end, the city buzzed with talk of Robert's coronation and the fate of the kingdom. Lord Tywin Lannister busied himself establishing alliances, ensuring that the Lannisters remained in good favor. Jaime Lannister was appointed to the Kingsguard, the very same order he had joined under the Mad King's rule. The realm was reeling from all the upheaval, and no one paid too much heed to Ned's quiet presence, or to the small babe who rarely emerged from Ned's private chambers. Yet one man had not been distracted. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's middle brother, maintained a watchful, suspicious eye. Stern and unyielding, Stannis had always been known for his rigid sense of justice. On the eve of Robert's coronation, Stannis cornered Ned in the Tower of the Hand, waiting in a dim corridor. Ned almost startled when he saw the Baratheon lord's somber face half concealed by torchlight. "Lord Stark," Stannis said in a voice that carried no warmth. "I would speak with you if you have a moment." Ned inclined his head, stepping aside to indicate that Stannis should follow him into a more private antechamber. He set a candle alight on a small table. The air was thick with tension even as Ned tried to keep calm. "What is it you wish to discuss, my lord?" Stannis pursed his lips before replying. "This child you claim as your bastard. Your reputation for honor is legendary, Lord Eddard. Most men who stray from their marriage vows rarely garner such surprise. But in your case, it is unexpected." Ned felt ice in the pit of his stomach. "I have no illusions that my honor remains untarnished by the circumstances of this child's birth," he said evenly. "But I will not speak further on it." Stannis's gaze flicked from Ned's face to the closed door behind which, presumably, the child slept. "My brother has accepted your story," he said, "but he is eager to leave the tragedies of war behind him. I am less inclined to ignore the incongruities. I do not accuse you outright of falsehood," he continued, his voice carefully measured, "but I feel the child might not be wholly safe here. You know as well as I do how our king feels about Targaryens and anything that remains of that line." Ned said nothing, choosing his silence as a shield. He stood rigid, his eyes never leaving Stannis. Inside, he could feel his heart hammering, but outwardly, he remained as stern as the father he had lost. Stannis lowered his head slightly. "I suppose I only wish to warn you, Lord Stark. Lies and secrets can grow into monstrous things if left in the shadows. I urge you, protect the child well if he is truly yours, and do not let falsehood corrode your honor." With that, Stannis turned and left the chamber, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Ned exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for days. He did not doubt that Stannis suspected something amiss. But Stannis was not the sort of man to spread rumors lightly or to act without proof. As long as Ned kept Jon Snow, whom he introduced to others as Jon Snow, behind closed doors and out of the public eye, no one would have reason to question the arrangement. Eventually, rumor might fade, people would accept that the child was indeed Ned's bastard, and life would carry on. Or so Ned wanted to believe. Time passed, the realm entered a tenuous peace, and the new king Robert Baratheon was crowned in a ceremony that was less extravagant than Aerys Targaryen's might have been, yet still splendid enough to impress the crowd. Lord Arryn, who had served as father figure to both Ned and Robert, was named as the king's advisor and the new regent until the realm stabilized. Cersei Lannister was soon betrothed to Robert, a strategic marriage that joined Baratheon might with Lannister wealth. The wedding was a lavish affair, though Ned found it distasteful, recalling how Tywin's men had butchered the Targaryen children. Still, politics was a game played for power, and Robert, who had once had eyes only for Lyanna Stark, found himself forced by necessity to accept this new bride. Ned remained at court longer than he wished, assisting the new king with setting up a stable government. Diplomats were sent out to quell unrest, lords were rewarded or punished, and the battered countryside began to show faint signs of recovery. During these months, Ned's only solace was the knowledge that his wife, Catelyn Tully, waited in the north, expecting their first child. He wanted desperately to return to Winterfell, to resume the life that had been upended by war, but duty demanded he stay. And the boy, Jon, was at the center of Ned's conflict. Hiding the child at King's Landing felt like watching a candle flicker amidst 1,000 drafts. Any gust might snuff it out. Any chance encounter or rumor might reveal the truth. Yet taking the child north carried its own risks. If Catelyn learned the secret, would she accept it? Would the boy's presence create tension among the northern lords? The vow was all that tethered Ned to this maddening secrecy. Lyanna's dying words echoed relentlessly. "Promise me, Ned." Days became weeks, weeks became months, and Robert, busy with the trifles of kingship, rarely gave Ned or the child more than passing thought. On rare occasions, he would ask after the boy with a friendly grin or a gruff word, but he never pressed too deeply. And so the child remained, growing a little each day, with dark hair and gray eyes that sometimes held a depth beyond his infant months. Ned would watch him, feeling torn between a father's affection and the dread that the day of discovery might come. Then, everything changed. There came a night so quiet and unremarkable. The entire city was lulled into a false sense of calm. Robert was out, feasting with lords and knights who had pledged themselves to him after the war, celebrating some fresh alliance. Ned was in the Tower of the Hand, reading by candlelight, the babe asleep in a cradle behind him. He expected nothing of note to happen that night, only another evening of tedious administrative tasks. But a faint scuffle broke the silence outside his door. He rose quickly, reaching for the sword he kept leaned against a chest. Suddenly, the door burst open. Ned's eyes widened at the sight of a trembling young man, a messenger by the look of him. "My lord," he panted. "The king, he's returned. He's calling for you. He is in a rage." Ned's heart jumped. He set aside his book, carefully scooped up John, and followed the messenger through the torchlit corridors. The Red Keep felt like a labyrinth at night, full of turns and twisting staircases, but soon they came upon the king's private solar. 2 guards stood at the door, looking grave. One guard glanced at the baby, then turned to Ned. "He wants you alone, my lord, but—" He paused, uncertain. "It would be best to do as he says. He's in no mind to be gainsaid." Ned swallowed. "I won't leave the child unattended," he said firmly. "I'll keep him with me." He pushed the door open, bracing himself for Robert's fury. The king stood with his back to the door, leaning upon the heavy wooden table that dominated the room. Candles in iron sconces cast his face in flickering shadow. Jon Arryn stood near him, hands folded anxiously. A few steps aside was Stannis, lips pressed tight. Robert turned and Ned's breath caught. He had seen Robert angry many times. Robert had always been quick to temper, especially if the topic of Targaryens arose. But this was a different kind of fury, mingled with a complicated anguish. Robert's eyes bored into the child in Ned's arms. "I have heard," Robert said softly. "Something that I pray to the Seven is not true." His voice was low, ragged, as though every word cost him. "Tell me this is not Rhaegar Targaryen's spawn." Ned stiffened. "Your Grace! Don't your grace me!" Robert bellowed, slamming his fist into the table. "Answer me now, Ned. I heard a whisper that the child you claim as your bastard was not sired by you at all, but by the very man I hated above all others. The man who stole your sister. The man I killed upon the Trident." Ned wanted to protest, to feign outrage. Yet he felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, freezing the words on his tongue. He glanced at Jon Arryn. The older man's expression was distraught, as if he, too, could not believe what had come to light. Meanwhile, Stannis's face seemed carved from stone, confirming that at least a portion of this had come from him. But had Stannis discovered some hidden proof, or was it a rumor from another source that he had chosen to investigate? Robert advanced, voice trembling with emotion. "All these months, Ned, I never asked about the mother. I accepted it as your mistake. I protected you from scandal, believing that you, of all men, would not lie to me. But here I am, forced to hear it from a rumor in the streets. They say the babe is Rhaegar's. Tell me it's a lie." For a heartbeat, Ned considered doubling down, calling it a foul rumor, a vile slander. Maybe that would be enough. But Robert's face was contorted in agony and betrayal, and Ned could not lie, could not keep the facade any longer. He held the baby close. "He is my nephew," Ned whispered, each word like a toll of a funeral bell. "He is Lyanna's son. And yes, Rhaegar Targaryen fathered him." A moment of utter silence filled the chamber, so thick that Ned could hear his own breathing. Robert's expression twisted through a range of emotions: shock, heartbreak, rage, disbelief. He staggered backward, falling into his chair as if the weight of the revelation had stolen all strength from his legs. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. You have sheltered a Targaryen under my nose," he managed, voice cracking. "Ned, how could you?" Ned's stance grew firm, protective. "It was Lyanna's final wish. She loved him, Robert. I do not deny your hatred of Targaryens, or your reasons for that hatred, but Lyanna was my sister. She asked me, begged me to protect her child. What would you have me do? Let him die? This innocent babe who had no hand in what happened. Robert's nostrils flared. Innocent? You call him innocent when his father... Rhaegar is dead. Ned pressed on, voice ringing with uncharacteristic steel. No matter what you thought of him, the boy has committed no crime. Jon Arryn stepped forward, brow knit. Robert, perhaps we can discuss this calmly. Eddard has always been loyal. He would never do something so grave unless compelled by the deepest sense of duty. He placed a hand on Robert's arm, trying to draw him from the brink of wrath. Stannis, his face still unreadable, finally spoke. The Targaryen line is what started the war. If word spreads that a Targaryen boy lives under the king's roof, you risk rebellions anew. Robert glared at Ned. He must die, he said, and there was a weary finality in his voice. He must die, Ned. I will not have another Targaryen with a claim to my throne. Not while I'm still breathing. Ned felt as if a sword had been driven through his chest. He clutched Jon protectively, stepping back. I swore an oath, he said hoarsely. I will not break it. This is Lyanna's child. Your betrothed. Your beloved's own flesh and blood. Do not speak to me of her. Robert roared, veins standing out on his neck. She is gone, stolen by Rhaegar, and now you bring me the spawn of that union. His eyes glistened with tears of fury. I loved her, Ned. Loved her more than life. This abomination is the living proof that she was with him. Ned's voice cracked. She was not abducted, Robert. She went willingly. That confession felt as though it slammed the air from Robert's lungs. He stared at Ned, lips parted, unable to speak for a moment. Then a tremor of rage coursed through him. He seized the table's edge, as though preventing himself from lunging at Ned, or perhaps from collapsing. How dare you? He managed, his tone hushed with horror. You claim my sweet Lyanna gave herself to that silver-haired bastard? She did, Ned said, voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in truth. I do not say it was right or wrong, but it was what happened. She carried his child. She gave birth at the Tower of Joy. She died in my arms, and her dying wish was that I protect her son from your wrath. He swallowed thickly. I lied to you because I knew you would kill him, and I will not be complicit in the murder of my sister's son. Robert's eyes bored into Ned with a kind of fury that threatened to dissolve their decades of friendship. For long moments, the king and the Lord of Winterfell stared at each other, each breath heavy with the possibility that violence could erupt. The baby in Ned's arms began to whimper, sensing the tension. Jon Arryn and Stannis both stood by, powerless to intervene. Finally, Robert broke the stare, lowering his gaze to the floor. His shoulders shook. He muttered something under his breath that no one caught. Then louder, he said, "Hand him over." Ned's jaw tightened. "I will not." Robert looked up, eyes wet with anger. "I am your king, damn you. If I command you to place that babe in my arms, you will obey, or I will have you arrested for treason. Do you hear me?" Ned let out a ragged breath. He glanced at Jon Arryn for help, but the older lord seemed shaken. If Robert commanded it, the guards outside would come in with steel, and Ned would be powerless against the might of the royal household. The child would die. Slowly, Ned carried the child forward, each footstep feeling heavier than the last. He drew close to Robert, who stood with arms outstretched, as though bracing himself to seize a venomous serpent. Ned knew that if he refused outright, he could spark a confrontation that might tear the realm apart. Already, he recalled the bloodshed of the rebellion. Could he spark another war if he defied the king in front of witnesses? He had promised Lyanna to keep the boy safe, yet how could he do that if he lost his own head? Jon Arryn stepped in, gently, placing a hand on the child's brow before Ned could relinquish him. "Robert," Jon Arryn pleaded, "this is a child of Lyanna's blood. If you kill him, that blood is on your hands." Lyanna's blood. Robert wavered, trembling. "She was everything to me." he whispered, staring at the babe, who opened his gray eyes in that moment, blinking at the torchlight. But when I see him, all I can see is Targaryen. His voice caught. Silver hair or not, I know what he is. For a long, tense moment, the king of the 7 kingdoms stood poised on the razor's edge between vengeance and mercy. The entire future of the realm seemed to rest on his next breath. Ned closed his eyes, praying to the old gods that Robert would relent. Then Robert let out a guttural cry, as though torn by some deep inner agony, and staggered back. "Take him," he spat. "Get him out of my sight. Lock him away. Hide him. Just... gods. I cannot look at him." His fists clenched. "If I ever see him again, or if I ever catch wind that he claims a right to my throne." He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished, but as tangible as a drawn sword. Ned wasted no time. He cradled Jon protectively and rushed out of the room, ignoring the stares of the guards, ignoring the tears that threatened to break forth. He did not stop until he was back in the Tower of the Hand, where he barricaded himself and the child behind locked doors. Only then did he slump to the floor, trembling with relief and sorrow, pressing the crying babe to his chest. He had bought Jon's life for now, but he knew Robert's hatred, once ignited, would not be easily quelled. Even though the king had not commanded the child's immediate execution, the threat loomed. And now Robert knew that the boy was Rhaegar's son, the last Targaryen with a claim. Cautiously, Ned sent word to Winterfell and arranged that he would depart the capital as soon as he could manage. He feigned other reasons, writing to Catelyn that he must attend pressing matters in the north, that the realm was stable enough for him to leave court for some months. But the real reason was to protect the boy from Robert's unpredictable tempers. Each day that Ned remained in King's Landing felt like walking on the edge of a sword. But Robert, it seemed, was not yet done with him. Within 2 days, a royal command arrived, summoning Ned to the throne room. Fear pulsed through him as he handed Jon to his steward, explicitly instructing that the babe remain out of sight until he returned. Then, wearing a formal doublet and cloak, Ned strode through the Red Keep's corridors to the cavernous throne room. He expected to see Robert perched atop the Iron Throne with fury blazing in his eyes, but what he found was a more subdued atmosphere. A handful of courtiers were present: Jon Arryn, Grand Maester Pycelle, Stannis Baratheon, and others. Robert sat leaning forward, elbows on his knees, as though the weight of the spiked metal behind him was too much to bear. "Ned," Robert began, voice echoing slightly in the vaulted space. "We must settle this matter." Ned inclined his head, choosing his words carefully. "I am at your service, your grace." Robert grimaced, the barest flicker of old friendship in his eyes. "You have put me in a difficult position," he said. "I have accepted your story as truth, though it rankles me to do so. The boy is Rhaegar's, and I will not abide any threat to my reign. But neither can I bring myself to slit his throat when he is Lyanna's." He paused, jaw clenching. "We have come to an arrangement." Stannis stepped forward, face stern. "Lord Stark, it is the king's wish that the boy be taken far from King's Landing, so that no one may exploit him as a Targaryen pretender. The north is vast, and men are loyal to you. The king believes that if the boy must be allowed to live, he should live in obscurity, with no claim to the Stark name or to the Iron Throne." Robert nodded. "He shall be known only as Jon Snow. He is your bastard by all accounts. If ever you breathe a word of who his father truly was, or if I hear that the boy is paraded about as some Targaryen prince, I will come for him. Do you understand?" Ned's throat tightened. "I do, your grace," he said softly, feeling relief and heartbreak swirl within. "You have my word. Jon Snow is my bastard." Robert let out a shuddering breath. "Go then, take him. Raise him if you must. Keep him hidden." He looked down at his hands, speaking more quietly. "And see to it that he never crosses my path again." Ned bowed, clinging to composure. He turned and left the throne room. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned inside him. Relief that Jon would live, guilt for continuing the lie, grief for the rift that had opened between him and Robert, and a grim determination to do right by his sister's son. Nothing about this would be easy, but at least the babe would breathe another day. Within a week, Ned had secured safe passage north. He carried a royal writ permitting him to depart with his household without interference. Robert had orchestrated the arrangement quietly, presumably not wishing to stir up more talk about the Targaryen child. Most courtiers assumed Ned Stark was simply returning to the north to resume his duties as warden. A hush fell over the matter in the Red Keep, as though it were an unpleasant memory they all wished to bury. Jon Arryn, sorrowful yet supportive, bid Ned farewell at the gates of the city. "Take care, Ned," he said, clasping the younger man's arm. "I pray that in time, the rift between you and Robert may heal." Ned gave a grim nod. "We shall see, but my path is set now. The north will be my home, for me and for Jon Snow." Without fanfare, without any of the grand courtesy that might normally attend the departure of a high lord, Ned slipped out of King's Landing, flanked by a small retinue of loyal northern men. In his arms, securely wrapped in furs, was the child who carried both Stark and Targaryen blood. The journey was long, but Ned found his heart lightened somewhat by the thought of returning to Winterfell, to the crisp air of his homeland, the howling of direwolves in the distance, the quiet acceptance of the old gods who watched from the weirwoods. Soon, the traveling party passed the neck and made their way into the domain of House Stark. Here, the land changed, growing colder and wilder. Yet Ned felt a sense of belonging with every league they crossed. The boy, too young to understand, would one day grow to see these same snowy hills and icy winds as his birthright. He would believe himself a bastard of House Stark, and he would never know just how his father had died at the Trident, or that the king in the south dreaded his very existence. When at last the gray walls of Winterfell rose before them, Ned closed his eyes and drew a breath of relief. He had returned home after the storm of war, after the chaos of rebellion. Inside the walls, Catelyn waited, pregnant with his trueborn heir. He thought of her reaction to the news that he would bring a bastard child into the castle. He dreaded the conversation, but it could not be avoided. The vow to Lyanna overshadowed everything else. They crossed the gates, and the courtyard bustled with stable hands, guards, and small folk. Catelyn Tully Stark appeared at the steps of the Great Keep, her face filled with hesitant joy. She was relieved to see her husband safe, but uncertain about the small bundle in his arms. She approached, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, and placed a hand on Ned's arm. "You have returned," she said softly, her voice edged with relief. "You wrote of a child." Ned nodded. He passed her gently but did not offer the babe. "His name is Jon Snow," he said heavily. "He is my son." Catelyn's eyes flickered with pain. "You're your son. I see." She swallowed hard, obviously fighting to maintain composure. "We will provide for him, of course. He is a child. It is not his fault." Ned felt an ache of guilt at the hurt in her voice. She deserved better than lies, but he could not reveal the truth to her, no matter how much he wanted to trust her. The secret was too large, too dangerous, and Robert's fury too real, so he merely bowed his head. "Thank you, Cat. I promise I will not allow him to come between us." She placed a trembling hand on the child's dark hair, reluctant. But she was a lady of the Tullus, raised in courtesy and honor, and so she nodded. "We shall find a wet nurse and rooms for him." Ned exhaled. He followed her inside, stepping into the familiar corridors of Winterfell, breathing in the scents of hearthfires and stone. The tension in his chest eased slightly, knowing that, at least for the moment, Jon Snow was safe. Here, in the north, the boy would have a chance to live, to grow. He would not be coddled by the illusions of royalty, nor would he be haunted by the ghosts of House Targaryen, if Ned could help it. Over the months that followed, Ned settled back into the role of Lord of Winterfell. He oversaw repairs from the war and reconnected with his people. He discovered that fatherhood was a more complex matter than he had anticipated, for while he awaited the birth of his and Catelyn's first child, he also tended to Jon. The boy quickly became a source of tension in the household. Some of Ned's bannermen muttered behind closed doors about the presence of a bastard in the Stark household. Catelyn, though outwardly polite, could not fully mask her resentment. When Catelyn gave birth to Robb Stark, Ned felt an immense surge of paternal pride. That same sense of protectiveness he felt for Jon swelled in him for Robb as well, forging a silent vow that both boys would be safe under his roof, though one was a Targaryen by blood and the other a true Stark heir. He doubted that Catelyn would ever truly embrace Jon, but neither would she show him cruelty, for her sense of honor forbade it. And so, day by day, the matter settled into an uneasy peace within the walls of Winterfell. Jon Snow learned to walk, to speak, to smile. He toddled after Ned in the yard, stumbling in the snowdrifts, and the guards would grin at the sight of their solemn lord being trailed by a bright-eyed bastard. The child's hair was a dark mop, reminiscent of the Starks, though the shape of his face sometimes revealed a hint of rigor. Ned prayed each day that no one would see the boy's mother or father in his features, that no rumor would ever slip north, that Robert Baratheon would remain content with the knowledge that the threat was contained. Yet Robert did not entirely forget. Occasionally, a raven would arrive from King's Landing, bearing a royal command or a subtle query. Lord Arryn would craft measured words about the realm's stability, or request some measure of support from the north. Each time, Ned read the letters with a sense of unease, wondering if, between the lines, there was a hidden threat. Do not forget your vow. The boy's identity must remain secret. For years, this precarious arrangement continued. The snows came and went, the harvests rose and fell. Robb Stark grew into a sturdy boy, and Jon Snow followed not far behind him in age and in skill. Together, they roamed the courtyard, parted only by their different statuses. They wrestled in the yard, learning the rudiments of swordplay with wooden blades. Robb's hair was a bright auburn brown, and he carried himself with a natural authority, while Jon was quieter, thoughtful, his gray eyes absorbing everything around him with intensity. Maester Luwin taught them their letters, patiently guiding Robb's quick but sometimes distracted mind, and Jon's earnest focus. Bran came along in time, then Sansa, then Arya, each child a blossoming addition to the Stark clan. Jon hovered on the fringes, beloved by some of the servants but never fully accepted by Catelyn or acknowledged as anything but a bastard. Still, he was fed, clothed, and sheltered within Winterfell's walls, never fully wanting for the necessities of life. In the minds of most who saw him, Jon Snow was simply Eddard Stark's indiscretion, a byproduct of war, a boy to be pitied or disliked according to the prejudices of the onlooker. Hardly anyone, aside from Ned and the gods, realized the cosmic significance of his parentage. The realm had seen no Targaryen restoration movements, no claimants rising to challenge King Robert. Viserys Targaryen and Daenerys Targaryen had fled across the narrow sea, or so rumor said, but the crown paid them no great heed, confident they could not amass the force needed for an invasion. Meanwhile, the hidden Targaryen was growing strong in the north, learning the ways of wolves under Ned Stark's stoic gaze. In the darkest hours of the night, sometimes Ned would linger by the boy's bedside, watching Jon breathe. He would remember Lyanna's face, pale with fever and blood loss, her eyes full of unspoken entreaty. You must protect him. Every day of Jon's life, Ned strove to do exactly that, though it tore him apart to hide the truth from so many, including the boy himself. Sometimes, when Jon asked about his mother, Ned could offer only half-truths and cryptic reassurance. Pained him more than he could say, but Robert's threat was forever in the back of his mind. The king's words, "If I ever hear that the boy is paraded about as a Targaryen," remained a sword dangling over Jon's head. Yet the north was vast, and rumors rarely traveled so far. Jon grew older day by day, his manner growing increasingly introspective. He watched Ned for any sign that might explain why his father hardly ever spoke of his mother, or why Lady Catelyn looked at him with thinly veiled resentment. To the boy's credit, he never openly challenged his father about it, perhaps sensing that he would not like the answer if he pried too hard. Instead, Jon channeled his frustrations into training, reading, or playing with his siblings, at least those siblings who would include him in their games. Robb accepted Jon as a brother in most ways that mattered, though Catelyn's disapproval prevented him from fully embracing the boy as an equal. Bran and Arya, still young, did not see the divisions as clearly, especially Arya, who found Jon's quiet nature comforting. Sansa, taught the ways of a proper Southern lady, was more inclined to follow her mother's lead, keeping Jon at arm's length. Yet still, in many ways, a family formed around the ancient hearths of Winterfell. Each year, however, Ned felt the tension mounting. If anything went awry in King's Landing, if Robert's mood soured, or if the realm faced a crisis, would the old suspicion resurface? The realm had found its king, an aging warrior who liked his feasts and tournaments, who fathered bastards of his own across the land. But Ned knew that the seeds of war were never truly gone. So long as a Targaryen heir existed, there would be those who might try to use that heir for their own ends. Someday someone might catch wind of the truth, perhaps Stannis or Littlefinger or Varys, someone cunning enough to read the signs. Then the precarious peace that Ned had brokered by appealing to Robert's last shred of love for Lyanna might shatter, and with it Jon's life might be forfeit. So Ned continued to insist that Jon was a bastard and must remain so. Even within Winterfell, the boy became known simply as the Bastard, a label that brought him shame and confusion as he grew older. Occasionally, Ned considered the possibility of telling him the truth, helping the boy understand why he was never recognized as a legitimate Stark. But then he would recall Robert's savage threats, and he would hold his tongue. Jon was safer living as a bastard. The risk of him learning the truth and foolishly proclaiming it in some fit of pride or heartbreak was too great. The years rolled on, and Robert's reign wore onward. The old camaraderie that had once existed between the king and the Lord of Winterfell never truly rekindled. When Ned traveled south for a matter of state, the greetings were cool, polite, overshadowed by that old betrayal. Robert drank heavily, hunted, and fathered children in brothels, while Queen Cersei maintained a frosty distance, forging alliances with Lannister influence. Rumors began swirling that the marriage was unhappy, that the king turned a blind eye to the queen's possible indiscretions. None of that concerned Ned overmuch, for he had his own troubles, his own regrets. He had failed to protect his sister from fate, and he could not give her son the life he truly deserved. But at least Jon was alive, and that was more than could be said for Rhaegar's other children. So the boy grew. Life in the north, though harsh, was stable enough for Ned to hold on to hope that the truth would never be known outside the walls of Winterfell. The small folk accepted Jon as a fixture, a polite enough lad who trained with sword and bow, who sometimes accompanied Robb and Theon Greyjoy on hunts. The direwolves had come one day, found in the snows, changing the destiny of each of the Stark children. Ghost, with his white fur and red eyes, chose Jon. More than one person found that curious, a white wolf for a black-haired bastard. But no one guessed the deeper meaning, the silent symbol of something both Stark and not Stark. Yet in Ned's heart, the fear remained, coiled like a serpent. Robert knew. Jon Arryn knew. Stannis knew. At any time that knowledge might slip. Or if the king drank too heavily and raged anew, he might send men to take the boy's head. Ned could only hope that the memory of Lyanna continued to stay Robert's hand. But with each passing year, the memory of a lost betrothed might grow weaker, overshadowed by fresh grudges, fresh desires. The king was known to be a man of appetites. Mercy could be fleeting. So Ned prayed to the old gods, and the gods would beneath the heart tree, the face carved into its trunk forever weeping red sap. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to keep this secret. He never spoke aloud the name Targaryen. He tried not to let his mind dwell on Rhaegar. Instead, he framed his prayer in simpler terms: "Keep my nephew safe." The bark of the heart tree gave no reply, but Ned felt a quietness settle in him, the sense that he was not alone. Perhaps the old gods heard. Perhaps the mother wolf that was Lyanna, from beyond the grave, guided them all. Thus, the life of Jon Snow continued, each day building upon the last, shaping him into a boy of quiet honor and determination. He carried wooden swords alongside Robb, raced around the courtyard with Arya. He observed the lords who came to speak with Ned, picking up bits of politics and courtesy. He asked questions about the wars, about King Robert, about dragons, always fascinated by the old stories of Targaryen conquest, as many northern boys were. If only he knew how intimately he was tied to that history. But Ned always steered him gently away from those questions, offering the barest scraps of knowledge, leaving the boy's curiosity unsated. As Jon approached manhood, the question of his future loomed. Bastards could join the Night's Watch, or become hedge knights, or serve in a lord's retinue. A few had even risen to small lordships of their own, though not without difficulties. Ned knew that some men might encourage him to send Jon to the Wall, to remove any chance that the boy might trouble Robb's inheritance. Catelyn herself had hinted at that once or twice, subtly, but the thought of sending Jon to the Wall, condemned to a life of celibacy and cold watch, seemed an unfair punishment for a boy whose only crime was existing. Yet Ned realized that might be the safest course for the realm, ensuring the Targaryen line did not flourish. Once more, he was torn between love and duty, just as he had been the day Lyanna made him promise. The choice would not be forced upon him yet, not until Jon was older. For now, Ned focused on guiding the boy's training, ensuring he grew strong and loyal to the Stark name. Each passing year that no word arrived from King's Landing about an impending execution was a year to be grateful for. Robert, it seemed, had chosen not to revisit the matter, or perhaps he had simply drunk away the memory of his heartbreak. Occasionally, Ned heard rumors that the king fathered more bastards in the capital, all recognized by the hush money or small gestures Robert dispensed. The hypocrisy of it all did not surprise Ned, but it still angered him that Robert might so easily condone his own bastards while condemning a child who was, after all, half Stark in truth. Yet times were peaceful, if uneasy, and the realm seemed to settle into the lull after the war. The Targaryen siblings across the sea were seldom mentioned in the north, though from the occasional letter Ned received from Jon Arryn, he gathered that the crown kept an eye on them. They posed no immediate threat. Ned suspected that if Viserys or Daenerys ever tried to sail west, Robert's fury would be rekindled. But what if they learned of another Targaryen in the north? It was a chain of possibilities Ned dared not contemplate. Seasons changed, and years passed, bringing Ned's children into adolescence. Robb grew taller, stronger, a natural leader among the northern boys. Sansa blossomed into a courteous lady with a sweet voice. Arya grew into a wild spirit with a knack for archery and mischief, and Bran was curious and quick to climb. Rickon, the youngest, was still a babe. And then there was Jon, weaving in and out of his half-siblings' lives, neither fully accepted nor fully shunned. He bore the label Snow with a quiet resolve that made Ned's heart ache. That quiet determination reminded him sometimes of Rhaegar's fabled melancholy, though he had never truly known the man. He only knew stories, rumors that Rhaegar had been bookish, private, thoughtful. It stung to think that Jon might mirror his father in any way, but part of Ned was oddly proud that the boy carried some spark of the Targaryen prince's noble temperament, if that meant he would grow into a good man. Ned did not see the day of reckoning looming on the horizon. He did not foresee that everything would change with a single raven, or that secrets would soon unravel. He hoped to live out his days in the quiet hold of Winterfell, watching his children, and his sister's child, grow, marry, and find their place in the world. The scars of Robert's rebellion were meant to fade, and the storms of the Seven Kingdoms were meant to pass them by. Yet the Seven Kingdoms had never been so merciful, and the old gods seldom gave respite without further trials. The seeds for another great shift in power were already planted at King's Landing, in the hearts of the ambitious and the cunning. The Lannisters circled the throne with watchful eyes. The Baratheon princes, legitimate and otherwise, stirred the realm's uncertain future. And across the sea, the last exiled Targaryens might dream of retaking their birthright. All while Jon Snow, the hidden scion of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, grew stronger day by day in the northern snows. But for now, in the quiet of Winterfell's yard, the clang of wooden swords rang out as Jon and Robb sparred, each testing the other's reflexes. Ned watched from the steps, arms folded. Catelyn stood beside him, her expression distant as she observed the practice. She had never fully forgiven the presence of the bastard, but she tolerated it for Ned's sake. The crisp air carried the smell of pine and distant frost. Wolves howled in the godswood, and the sun's pale light gave the yard a stark beauty. Ned's heart twisted with an emotion that was neither entirely sorrow nor entirely hope. He had defied a king, kept a secret that could shatter the realm, and placed all his hopes in the innocence of a child who bore the name Snow but carried the blood of the dragon. Sometimes Ned wondered if the day would come when that blood would burn too bright to be contained. If that day ever came, Ned would be powerless to stop it. He had done his part, protected the boy, raised him to be honorable, taught him the ways of the North. What Jon Snow chose to do with those lessons would be his own fate. And if Robert Baratheon ever discovered that the boy had become more than just a quiet shadow, the old vow of mercy might not hold. Yet for now peace endured. The courtyard rang with the song of wooden blades, and a boy with gray eyes parried a blow, determination in his stance. The watchers saw only a bastard and a trueborn heir in friendly competition. They did not see the collision of centuries of history, the swirl of ice and fire that ran through Jon's veins. Ned's gaze flicked to the sky, where clouds drifted lazily, oblivious to mortal struggles. Perhaps the gods alone knew what destiny awaited Jon Snow, and what devastation or deliverance he might bring to the realm. At least Ned Stark had kept his promise. Lyanna's son still lived. He had not been cast into the flames of Robert's hatred, nor was he left to starve in obscurity. There was a chance, however faint, that he would find a good life, forging bonds with the siblings who did not share his name but shared his home. And maybe, in the fullness of time, if the winds of winter blew harshly, he would prove himself worthy of the Stark legacy, or perhaps even something greater. But that would be a story for another day. For now, no one but Ned and a handful of men in King's Landing truly knew who Jon Snow was. And though it weighed upon Ned's conscience, it was the only way to keep the boy breathing. So, day after day, he rose before dawn, prayed by the heart tree, and carried the secret in his heart. What if Robert Baratheon had learned of Jon Snow's Targaryen parentage from the very beginning? He had learned it indeed, and the realm still trembled with the consequences. But the child lived, and that single fact might someday shape the fate of Westeros, in ways that even Ned Stark could not foresee.